I came back home at 3 p.m., the suitcase still untouched in the car, the flowers still carrying the scent of the early morning. The kitchen was cold and lifeless. My wife's phone was turned off. Her car was not in the garage. The strangest thing was the small notebook she always kept beside her phone. Today, it had been shoved hastily into a drawer, and on today's calendar page there was only a single letter. R. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, my heart pounding so hard my ears rang. I had lied and said I was going on a work trip to surprise my wife. But in that moment, I understood very clearly. I was the one about to be surprised. And I had a gut feeling that if I hadn't come back today, I might never have known that I had already died in my wife's life a long time ago. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. My name is Howard Miller. I am 72 years old, born and raised in Briar Hollow, a small town nestled among the green hills of Kentucky. Here, people know each other from childhood, recognize the sound of a neighbor's pickup truck engine, and grow used to the smell of apple pie baking every Sunday afternoon. I've lived almost my entire life in this town, and I never once imagined that the very house I lived in would one day make me tremble like a lost man. I was married to Elaine Miller for 43 years. To the people of Briar Hollow, Elaine was not just my wife. She was a former elementary school principal, a strict but devoted woman whom generations of students still respectfully called Principal Miller. To me, Elaine was the woman I built everything with, from this red brick house to our 2 children, who are now grown, married, and have children of their own. After retirement, our life seemed to enter a peaceful stage. No more school bells, no more parent meetings stretching late into the evening. We woke up later, drank coffee on the porch, read the local paper, and discussed which grandchild to visit first on the weekend. I often joked with Elaine that we had retired from the noise of the world. That was why the idea of surprising my wife came to me in such a naive, almost childish way. I told Elaine I needed to visit an old friend in the next town over and would be gone for a day or 2. In truth, I had prepared flowers, a bottle of wine Elaine liked, and planned to come back early to cook dinner for the 2 of us. The kind of surprise men my age still foolishly believe can refresh a marriage. That morning, Elaine walked me to the door as usual. No arguments, no extra questions. She simply reminded me to drive carefully, then went back inside. I loaded the suitcase into the car, started the engine, turned onto the familiar road, and drove straight to my old machine shop on the edge of town. The shop doesn't operate regularly anymore, but I still keep the key. I sat there for a few hours, wiped dust off the old wooden workbench, drank cold coffee, then drove back home when the clock showed almost 3 p.m. I never expected to walk into such a terrifying silence. The back door was still locked, just like every other day. I opened it and softly called Elaine's name. No answer. In the kitchen, the kettle was right where it belonged, but stone cold. There was no note on the table, no message saying, "I stepped out for a bit," no obvious sign of urgency. Just a strange emptiness, as if someone had drained all the warmth out of the house. I walked into the living room. The armchair Elaine liked to read in was neatly in place, the thin blanket folded carefully. But her phone, the one she had been carrying everywhere these past months, was not on the table. I tried calling her. The phone was powered off. My heart began to race. I hurried to the garage. The spot where Elaine usually parked was empty. At that point, I tried to calm myself. Maybe she went out shopping. Maybe her phone battery died. But then I opened the drawer beside the dining table, where Elaine usually kept her small notebook with her daily schedule, and noticed it had been shoved inside unnaturally. I pulled it out and flipped to today's page. There was no to-do list, no names, no familiar notes, just one single letter written in firm strokes, R. I didn't know what that letter meant, but what I felt wasn't curiosity. It was a chill running down my spine. I stood in the living room for a long time. The house I had personally repaired brick by brick, window frame by window frame, suddenly felt unfamiliar. Every object was in its proper place, yet I had the strange sensation that I was standing in a house that no longer belonged to me. I tried calling my daughter. She sounded surprised and asked why I was home when I was supposed to be on a work trip. I awkwardly lied and said I was just calling to check in. I called a few of Elaine's close friends. No one knew where she was. Some answered evasively, others hesitated, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing. By then, my worry had turned into fear. Not the ordinary fear of someone being missing, but something deeper and more unsettling. The fear that I was no longer part of the life of the woman I had called my wife for over 4 decades. I sat down in Elaine's armchair, holding the notebook, staring at the letter R as if it might explain itself. I didn't understand what was happening. I only knew that from that moment on, the sense of stability I believed I had was officially gone. And for the first time in my life, I realized there were things more frightening than betrayal, like beginning to suspect that you may never have truly existed in the heart of the person beside you. I sat there for a long time, the notebook still in my hands, while my mind drifted back to distant years. Years when I still believed my life, though hard, was at least honest and straightforward. I was born in Kentucky into a true working-class family. My father did all kinds of odd jobs around the area, from repairing farm machinery to hauling lumber. My mother worked at a small canning factory outside town. We weren't starving poor, but we were never comfortable. In winter, cold winds slipped through the cracks in the old doors, and my mother stuffed rags into them to keep out the chill. In summer, we slept with the windows open, listening to insects and smelling damp earth after the rain. I grew up in a place where people didn't talk much about dreams. They talked about work, about what needed to be done to get through the next week, the next month. As a teenager, I understood that if I wanted to survive, I had to know how to use my hands. At 14, I apprenticed with a relative in a small machine shop. At first, I just swept floors, carried tools, wiped grease, but soon I was drawn to the sound of metal, to the feeling of controlling something hard, hot, and dangerous. Machining, turning, welding. I learned each skill slowly but solidly. No school, no certificates, just fix mistakes, redo failures. There were nights I came home with blistered hands and an aching back, but inside I felt something very clear. I knew where I was going. I wasn't rich, but I was independent. And for a boy who grew up with little, that mattered more than any vague promise. I met Elaine in the early 1970s when she had just moved to Briar Hollow to teach. The town was much smaller back then, and a young teacher arriving from the city was something everyone noticed. I remember clearly the first time I saw her. She walked into the hardware store where I was shopping, wearing a simple dress, holding a shopping list, looking slightly unsure, like someone not yet used to the slow rhythm of the place. We spoke only briefly that day. Elaine asked for directions to the elementary school, and I showed her. Her voice was gentle, clear, unhurried. I don't know why I remembered that moment for so long. Only that when Elaine left, I stood still for a few seconds, as if something had passed by that I hadn't quite caught. We ran into each other a few more times, then gradually became familiar. Elaine was different from the women I had known. She was educated, had a broader view of the world than this small town, yet never acted superior. She listened when I talked about work, about metal, about things that seemed dry and technical. And I listened when she talked about students, books, and children who needed guidance more than punishment. When we decided to take things further, everything happened simply. No drama, no spectacle. Both families knew who we were and how we lived. In Briar Hollow, people didn't judge by promises, but by how you had lived in the years before. I was a hard-working mechanic, not a drunk. Elaine was a devoted teacher without scandal. That was enough. We got married in a small ceremony at the local church. The weather that day was neither too sunny nor rainy. I remember clearly holding Elaine's hand, feeling that I finally had someone to walk the long road ahead with. Neither of us spoke romantically about forever. We talked about tomorrow, about what needed to be done next. The early years of marriage were not easy. We lived in a small rented house with simple furniture. I worked longer hours, took extra jobs when I could. Elaine taught during the day and graded papers at night, but we didn't complain. Every evening after dinner, we sat side by side, sometimes not saying much, just knowing the other was there. When we had enough money, we bought a small plot of land and built our own house. I did much of the work myself. Elaine helped paint the walls and plant trees. Our 2 children were born one after the other, and life seemed to settle into a steadier rhythm. Elaine continued to advance in education while I opened my own shop. Not big, but enough to support our family and give work to a few people we knew in town. Elaine earned more and more respect. She wasn't just a teacher, then vice principal, then principal. She was someone parents turned to when their children had problems. I often stood in the back row at school ceremonies watching Elaine speak, feeling a quiet pride. I didn't talk about it much, but inside I always thought, this woman deserves people's trust. In the eyes of Briar Hollow, we were a model family. People spoke of us as a steady, hard-working couple with no drama. I never objected to that image because it matched what I believed I was living. I trusted Elaine, in the simplest way, without conditions, without doubt. For 43 years, I never once thought my wife's loyalty was something that needed to be questioned. To me, marriage wasn't a guessing game. It was companionship. Waking up each morning knowing the person beside you was still there, looking in the same direction. Perhaps that was why, when things began to drift, I didn't notice right away. I was too used to believing that what I saw was the whole truth. And when that belief started to shake, I learned a painful lesson. Not every marriage that looks solid is truly without cracks. But at that time, in my memory, Elaine was still the woman I had walked beside for nearly half a century. And I, Howard Miller, never imagined that one day I would be sitting alone in that house, wondering whether, throughout all those years, I had missed something so important it could never be repaired. After Elaine officially retired, the rhythm of our household changed very slowly. So slowly that at first I didn't recognize it as change at all. I simply thought old age was quietly adjusting each of our habits. Mornings no longer began with a harsh alarm clock. Elaine no longer rushed to make coffee and dash out the door with stacks of papers in her arms. She had time to sit longer at the kitchen table, read the newspaper, watch local news. I thought that was a good thing. After more than 40 years of responsibility, who didn't deserve to slow down? But then, just a few months later, Elaine became busy again, in a different way. She said she joined a retirees activity group, then a book club, then a short class in the city. At first, I didn't doubt a thing. I even encouraged her. I told her having her own activities was healthy, that I didn't want her stuck at home with just the garden and flower pots. Elaine smiled, kissed my cheek, and said I was always thoughtful. Gradually, though, her schedule became strangely full. Some weeks, Elaine went out almost every day. The group names and class names sounded familiar, so familiar they left no concrete impression. When I asked, She answered smoothly, without hesitation. But those answers were no longer consistent. One day, Elaine said the class was in the morning. A few weeks later, the same class was suddenly in the afternoon. I didn't argue. I told myself older people's memories aren't as sharp as they used to be, mine included. But what truly caught my attention was the phone. Elaine had never been glued to a screen before. She could leave her phone on the table all afternoon without noticing a missed call. Now it was always within reach. If she stood up, she took it with her. If she went into the garden, it was in her pocket. Even when she went into the bathroom, I saw her bring it along. At first, I just found it odd. Then it became irritating. Finally, it turned into a vague sense of unease. I didn't ask. I didn't want to become the kind of old husband who secretly watches his wife. I still believed that trust, built over decades, shouldn't be destroyed by vague suspicions. Then there was her appearance. Elaine had never been sloppy, but she also wasn't overly concerned with looks. Most of the time, she wore simple, comfortable clothes. After retirement, though, she began to take noticeably more care of herself. More frequent hair salon visits, new skincare bottles appearing on the bathroom shelf, a few dresses I had never seen before, hanging neatly in the closet. I complimented her. I told her she looked beautiful. Elaine smiled, but it wasn't as relaxed as before. Once, when I jokingly asked, "So, who's the lucky one who gets to see you looking this good today?" She paused briefly, then turned away, pretending to look for something in her purse. Those small details, one by one, weren't enough to form a story, but they stacked quietly, like tiny cracks in a wall that looked solid from afar. Elaine still told me about her activities and short day trips, but her stories began to have gaps. Some details didn't match. Some names appeared, then disappeared. I didn't write them down, but in my mind, they didn't stay still. One afternoon, I ran into Martha, our neighbor, who was also retired and occasionally joined community activities with Elaine. We stood chatting by the fence the way older folks in Briar Hollow do. I casually asked about the book club meeting. Elaine said she had attended the day before. Martha frowned, thought for a few seconds, then said the meeting had been canceled because the facilitator was sick. Her tone held nothing but simple truth. But I froze. That evening, Elaine told me about that meeting in great detail. She talked about the book, the discussion, the people there. I listened, nodded, didn't interrupt. In my head, Martha's words and Elaine's story collided, didn't align, couldn't be reconciled. I had the chance to ask her directly. I could have said I knew the meeting hadn't happened, but I didn't. I chose silence. Not because I was afraid to confront her, but because I was afraid of the answer. Afraid that if I asked, I would hear something I wasn't ready to accept. I convinced myself Elaine might have mixed up the date, or Martha might have remembered wrong, or that I was exaggerating things because age had made me suspicious. I told myself a marriage couldn't survive if every detail was put under a microscope. I reminded myself of the 43 years we had shared, of the hardships we had overcome together. I didn't want to believe all of that could be erased by a few vague signs, but no matter how hard I tried, my intuition refused to stay quiet. There were nights I woke up to see Elaine lying with her back to me, the dim light of a phone screen reflecting on the ceiling. When I shifted, she quickly turned the screen off and pretended to sleep. I lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the breathing of the woman I had slept beside for nearly half a century, wondering when an invisible distance had grown between us. I didn't share my fear with anyone, not with my children, not with friends. At this age, no one wants to become a joke because of suspicions without proof. I also didn't want to shatter the family image we had built in other people's eyes. But some things, even when left unspoken, still exist. They live in the pauses between stories, in the avoided glances, in the cold feeling of someone being right beside you while their mind is somewhere else. I began to realize that the most frightening thing wasn't change itself. What was frightening was sensing that change, yet not knowing where it was leading me. And at 72 years old, when everything should have been clearer than ever, I found myself stepping into a fog I had never prepared to face. The intuition of an old man, an intuition sharpened by a lifetime of watching and enduring, would not allow me to keep pretending that everything was fine. I had no proof, I had no confession, but I knew one thing very clearly. Something was happening behind my back, and sooner or later I would have to face it, whether I wanted to or not. After countless sleepless nights and mornings that began in silence, I gradually formed a new habit: observing. Not in a spying way, but by paying closer attention to things I had once taken for granted. I stopped asking so many questions. I listened. I remembered. I let things reveal themselves in their own way. One early autumn afternoon, I had to go up to Louisville to pick up some old parts for the shop. The sky was clear and cool that day, the kind of weather that makes you want to pull over, drink coffee, and watch people pass by. I stopped at a small cafe near the square, a place where older folks often gathered to read the paper and talk about current events. It wasn't crowded. I ordered black coffee and sat at a table by the window. While absent-mindedly looking outside, I suddenly heard a familiar name spoken near the counter. Not my name, Elaine's. A woman's voice said it casually, as if mentioning someone she knew. I turned my head on instinct, my heart pounding. In the corner of the cafe, near the opposite window, Elaine was sitting. She wore a cream-colored coat, her hair neatly styled, looking completely different from her usual simple appearance at home. Sitting across from her was an older man, tall, straight-backed, wearing a dark shirt and a polished jacket. He looked like someone accustomed to meetings like this, unhurried, unawkward. I stood there, barely breathing. Not because I was afraid of being seen, but because I hadn't yet understood what I was witnessing. They talked quietly. There were no obvious intimate gestures, no hand-holding, no leaning in too close. But there was something even clearer than intimacy: familiarity. The way Elaine smiled, the way she tilted her head while listening, the way the man rested his hand on the table. All of it carried the feeling of two people who had shared many afternoons like this before. I didn't walk over. I didn't call her name. I sat there, my coffee growing cold, my eyes fixed on a scene I had never prepared myself to face. That day, Elaine had told me she had a class in the city. I remembered clearly because she had repeated the time more than once and asked me to double-check the plumber's appointment to avoid a conflict. And now that class was right in front of me, in the form of a cafe table and a stranger. They sat together for nearly an hour. There was nothing I could step in and say I had caught her doing, but there was also nothing innocent enough for me to convince myself it was just a harmless coincidence. When they stood to leave, the man opened the door for Elaine and placed his hand lightly on her back. A very restrained gesture, yet painfully familiar. I stayed seated for a long time afterward. When I finally stood up, my knees felt stiff, as if my body had aged several more years in just one afternoon. I drove back to Briar Hollow in silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't think about what I would say when I got home. I knew only one thing: I would not confront her, at least not yet. That evening, Elaine came home right on time, just like on every class day. She spoke smoothly about the session, the topic, the instructor, a few classmates. I sat across from her, nodded, asked just enough questions to avoid seeming suspicious. Elaine answered without stumbling, but I noticed details she added. Details that sounded reasonable, yet were oddly generic. From that day on, I began to notice the pattern. Every 2 weeks, Elaine had a reason to go into the city. Sometimes it was a class, sometimes a group meeting, sometimes a special activity. Each time she went, she prepared more carefully than usual. Each time she returned, she seemed tired. But it was a kind of tiredness mixed with a vitality I couldn't quite name. I didn't follow every trip. I didn't want to turn into an old man suspicious of everything. But I remembered the dates, I noticed the timing, and I realized something that sent a chill through me. Everything was happening with a regularity that felt deliberate. The feeling of being excluded from my own wife's life didn't come all at once. It came gradually, like water seeping through a foundation. I began to notice there were stories Elaine no longer told me, decisions she made without asking my opinion, not because they were important, but because they no longer involved me. Some evenings we sat in the same room, watching the same television program, yet I knew Elaine's mind was elsewhere. She laughed at moments that weren't funny. She answered my questions more slowly. And sometimes, when her phone vibrated, she left the room to take the call. I wasn't jealous in a loud, dramatic way. I wasn't angry. What I felt was a quiet kind of distance, as if I were living in a house where every room was locked and I was only allowed to stand in the hallway. Once, I asked Elaine if she was tired from traveling so much. She looked at me, her eyes flickering for just a moment, then smiled and said she felt younger when she went out, met people, learned new things. I didn't argue. I just nodded. But inside, a question echoed that I didn't dare say out loud. Younger for whom? I gradually understood that when the truth is hidden long enough and skillfully enough, it doesn't reveal itself in big pieces. It only leaves behind small fragments, just enough for someone attentive to pick up and piece together. And when I started assembling them, the picture that emerged looked nothing like the life I thought I was living. I no longer felt angry. The emotion that took over then was a quiet sadness. The sadness of someone realizing he is standing on the sidelines of a story in which he should have been the main character. Every night I asked myself, if I confront her directly, what will happen? Will Elaine lie again, or will the truth spill out like water breaking through a dam? I wasn't ready. Not because I was weak, but because I needed to be certain that once I stepped forward, there would be no turning back. At this age, there aren't many chances to start over. Every decision carries heavy consequences, and I understood very clearly that once the truth was spoken, my 43-year marriage would never be the same again. So I remained silent. I continued observing. I continued letting Elaine believe everything was fine. But deep inside, I had accepted a cold reality. Someone else existed in my wife's life, and that person was not me. The truth was being hidden very carefully. But nothing stays hidden forever. And deep down, I knew the day I would be forced to face it was drawing closer with every trip, every incomplete sentence, every silence between the two of us. After those regular trips to the city, Elaine began talking about something new, short trips, just for women. She spoke about them lightly, as if they were obvious things I should understand and support. Retired friends going to see a festival together. A few-day trip to change the air. The destination sounded familiar, far enough that a day trip wasn't practical, but not so far as to raise alarm. At first I nodded. I said she deserved to relax. I said after a lifetime of caring for family and school, she should enjoy some time of her own. Elaine smiled, a look of relief in her eyes. But when I asked very naturally whether I could join one trip just for fun, she shook her head immediately. "It's just women," Elaine said. "You going wouldn't be convenient." Her tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm. There was no room for negotiation. I smiled and joked that I would just sit in the hotel reading the newspaper and wouldn't bother anyone. Elaine didn't smile back. She turned away, pretending to be busy packing. That refusal, which seemed small, made me feel as though I had just been shut out behind an invisible door. The trips began happening more often. Every time Elaine packed her suitcase, the bedroom felt unfamiliar again. She chose her clothes more carefully, folding each piece neatly. I stood in the doorway watching, saying nothing. I didn't want to turn those moments into tension. I also didn't want to hear another explanation. Elaine left. The house grew quiet again. I ate alone, slept alone, watched television without remembering any of it. I told myself it was just the normal emptiness an old husband feels when his wife is away. But when Elaine returned, what I longed for most, that familiar warmth, never came. With each return, she was a little colder. Not cold in a hostile way, but distant in a way that was hard to grasp. Elaine answered when I asked questions, but her replies were shorter. She didn't talk much about the trips the way she once talked about her work at school. Long silences began appearing between us, silences that had never existed before. Once, as Elaine hung her coat on the hook, I noticed a thin bracelet with a soft metallic sheen on her wrist. I had never seen it before. I asked, trying to keep my voice normal, when she bought it. Elaine glanced down, as if she had forgotten she was wearing it, then said it was something she picked up on the trip. Nothing special. I nodded, but inside a question surfaced. Why hadn't she mentioned it before? Small items began to appear. A new pair of earrings, a silk scarf, an unfamiliar perfume. Not flashy or expensive, but subtle enough for someone attentive to notice. I wasn't knowledgeable about fashion, but I had lived with Elaine long enough to know those things didn't belong to her old habits. Then came the receipts. I was used to checking paperwork. Not out of control, but out of habit from years in business. One afternoon, while sorting through documents, I accidentally saw one of Elaine's credit card statements mixed in with the mail. I hadn't intended to look. But the number caught my eye. A charge at a hotel. Not enormous, but clearly not something that fit the group trips Elaine had described. The date matched a weekend she had said she stayed home, attending local activities. I sat down, the statement in my hand, my mind blank. I read it again, hoping I had misread it, but the number was still there, cold and unmistakable. That evening, I asked Elaine, not accusingly. I showed her the statement and said perhaps the bank had made a mistake. Elaine looked at the paper, her eyes flickering, just for a second, then quickly regained her composure. "Banks make mistakes all the time," she said. "I'll call them and take care of it." Her voice was confident, too smooth. There was none of the confusion of someone truly surprised. I watched her carefully, searching for a sign, a frown, a quick breath. But there was nothing. She folded the statement, set it aside, as if it were just a minor errand to handle. I didn't ask anything more, not because I fully believed her explanation, but because I wanted to believe it. I wanted to hold on to the illusion that it was all just an unfortunate coincidence. I told myself one receipt couldn't erase 43 years of marriage. I told myself that if I dug deeper, I might find something I wasn't strong enough to bear. But from that moment on, my trust was no longer whole. I began seeing everything through a thin haze. Each of Elaine's trips was no longer an innocent getaway. Each new item was no longer just shopping. Each brief answer was no longer simple fatigue. They connected in my mind, forming a picture I wasn't yet ready to face. Some nights, I lay listening to Elaine's steady breathing beside me, wondering when we had become two people sharing the same space, but no longer the same story. I remembered the earlier years when every work trip I took ended with me telling Elaine every small detail. Now, I was the one staying behind. and the one leaving no longer brought stories back for me. I didn't tell the children. I didn't tell friends. At this age, no one wants to be looked at with pity. I also didn't want to destroy the family image we had carefully built in the community. I chose silence as a way to delay the truth. But silence doesn't heal. It only stretches the uneasy space between belief and doubt, between hope and suspicion. I realized I was living in a suspended state, where everything looked fine on the surface, but underneath small pieces were already falling away. Every time Elaine pulled her suitcase out of the closet, my heart sank. It was no longer ordinary longing, but a sense of loss even before anything had fully happened. I watched her walk out the door, and in my head a question repeated endlessly. With each trip, how much farther away is she moving from me? I accepted Elaine's explanations not because they were convincing, but because I wasn't ready to face the alternative. I prolonged the illusion, like someone holding their breath underwater, knowing they would eventually have to surface. And even though I couldn't yet name it, I understood one thing very clearly. Once trust is cracked, it never returns to what it was. It can be covered, patched up, but the fracture will always be there, waiting for the day it can no longer be ignored. After that night, when my thoughts refused to settle, I understood I couldn't continue living in that suspended state any longer. I couldn't keep pretending to believe while quietly doubting, torturing myself with questions that had no answers. At this age, there isn't much time left to live in uncertainty. Either you face the truth, or you accept living out the rest of your life under a truth that has been carefully concealed. The idea of pretending to leave didn't come to me as some elaborate plan, but as a survival instinct. I needed space, not to run away, but to see more clearly what was happening when I wasn't there. I asked myself, if I disappeared for a few days, how would Elaine live? What would she do? And most of all, would she need me? I told Elaine that I was going to visit an old friend in another town, staying a few days to clear my head. The story sounded reasonable enough. I'd taken trips like that before, so she didn't ask many questions. There was no worried look, no detailed reminders, just a nod and the familiar "drive safely," spoken more out of habit than feeling. I didn't tell the children, not because I wanted to hide anything from them, but because I had nothing solid to say yet. I didn't want to plant doubts in their minds when I myself still couldn't name what I was feeling. They were grown, with lives of their own, families of their own. They didn't need to carry the unease of an old father who wasn't sure of anything yet. I wanted to face it myself first, whatever the outcome might be. Only after the decision was made did I realize how heavy it was. Part of me still hoped that all my suspicions were just products of old age, of loneliness after retirement. I thought maybe all it would take was a small push, a dinner, a gesture of care, to pull Elaine back to me, back to us. The other part of me was colder, more realistic. That part whispered that if I didn't do this, I would never know the truth, and the doubt would eat away at me for the rest of my life. So the purpose of that trip away became twofold. It was both a final attempt at repair and a test I never thought I would have to run in a marriage. I began preparing as if it were a real trip. I took the suitcase down from the attic, placed it on the bed, folded a few sets of clothes inside. I let everything happen in front of Elaine. No hiding, no rushing. She glanced over and asked how many days I'd be gone. I said about 4 or 5 days. Elaine nodded and didn't ask anything else, but alongside that suitcase, I prepared something else, a surprise dinner. I stopped by the familiar flower shop where I used to buy flowers for Elaine on anniversaries and special occasions. The owner still remembered me, joked about whether there was another special day coming up. I smiled and said I just wanted to bring flowers home. I chose a simple bouquet, nothing fancy, exactly the kind Elaine used to like, soft colors, nothing showy. I bought a bottle of wine she often drank, the kind we used to open on the rare evenings we still sat together after retirement. I planned to cook a dish Elaine liked, even though I knew I wasn't as quick on my feet as I used to be. I wanted everything to unfold slowly, warmly, like the early years when we were still young. As I prepared, guilt crept in. I had never been good at lying. My whole life, I'd been used to saying what I did and doing what I said. Now I was constructing a story to deceive the woman I had lived with for more than 40 years. The thought made me feel small and exhausted. At times, I wondered whether I was betraying the very values I had always believed in. But then my intuition rose again. A quiet but firm voice reminded me that if I didn't cross this line, I would always remain outside the truth. I remembered the receipts, the trips, the avoided looks. I remembered the emptiness I felt when Elaine came home after each trip. And I knew that no matter how painful it might be, I needed to know where I stood in my own life. The morning of my departure came faster than I expected. I woke up earlier than usual. Elaine was still asleep, turned away from me. I looked at her hair, now streaked with gray in the dim morning light, and a dull ache rose in my chest. How many years had it been since we'd been apart like this? Not because of work, not because of circumstances, but because of the silence between two people who had once been so close. I rolled the suitcase into the living room. The sound of the wheels on the floor seemed louder than usual. Elaine woke up and came out of the bedroom. She looked at me with sleepy eyes and asked if I'd eaten breakfast yet. I shook my head and said I'd eat on the road. We stood there for a few seconds as if both of us were waiting for the other to say something, but neither of us did. Elaine stepped closer and placed a light kiss on my cheek. That kiss was distant, lacking the familiar warmth, like a gesture done out of habit rather than feeling. I felt it clearly, even though I wished I didn't. "Drive safely," she said. "I'll call," I replied. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was cool, but my chest felt heavy. I put the suitcase in the trunk, closed it, then slid into the driver's seat. In the rearview mirror, I saw Elaine standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. There was no wave, no smile. I started the engine and drove away from the familiar road leading out of town. But instead of going far as I'd said, I drove only a short distance before turning in another direction toward my old shop. When the car stopped, I sat there for a long time, my hands still on the steering wheel. I had left home, but I hadn't really gone anywhere. In that moment, I understood that from now on, nothing would be the same. Whatever I discovered in the coming days, this decision to pretend to leave had set me on a path I couldn't turn back from. And all I could do was hope I was strong enough to walk it, no matter what truth was waiting at the end. I stayed at the shop until nearly noon that day, doing small tasks just to keep my hands busy. But my mind wasn't there. It was in the red brick house, at the cold kitchen table, with the woman I had lied to about leaving. I waited for a call. I waited for a message asking how I was, or at least a familiar reminder. Nothing came. By early afternoon, I decided to go back. Not to reveal my plan, but to see how things were unfolding when I was not there. I parked a short distance from the house and walked around to the back. The house was silent. No television sounds, no running water in the kitchen, no familiar smell of food. I opened the door with my key and softly called Elaine's name. No answer. I checked the garage first. Elaine's parking spot was empty. I stood there for a few seconds, my heart beating faster. Maybe she'd gone shopping. Maybe she was meeting friends. I told myself that, even though I could hear how unconvincing my own voice sounded. I went inside and walked through the house. The living room was tidy, the bedroom neat. No suitcase, no signs of preparing for a long trip. I opened the closet. Her clothes were all there. Everything was in place except the person. I tried calling Elaine. The phone was off. I called again and again. The same result. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I called my daughter, asking casually whether her mother had stopped by. She sounded surprised and said no. I called my son and asked the same thing. The answer was still no. I called two friends Elaine often mentioned in her stories about activity groups. No one knew where she was. Some answered quickly, some slowly, but all were the same in one way. No one seemed surprised. That made me even more uneasy. By early evening, I could no longer calm myself. I drove to the town police station, where I was a familiar face. The officer on duty listened, nodded, asked a few basic questions. When I said my wife wasn't answering her phone and no one knew where she was, he sighed and explained that there wasn't enough to file a missing person report. "She's an adult," he said gently. "She may have just gone somewhere without notice. We need at least 24 hours, or clear signs of danger." I stood there, listening to words that were reasonable yet hollow. I understood procedures. I understood rules. But I understood something else too. Elaine had never disappeared like this. Never. I left the station after dark. The streetlights glowed dimly, the road quiet. I drove slowly, as if going too fast might make me miss something important. When I got home, I turned on all the lights. The brightness made the house less frightening, but it didn't ease my worry. I sat down at the kitchen table, set my phone in front of me, and waited. Time passed painfully slowly. With every hour, the unease inside me grew heavier. I called Elaine's number again. Still off. That was when I knew I couldn't just sit and wait anymore. I needed to look for clues, even the smallest ones. I began searching the house, not in panic, but with cold focus. I checked kitchen drawers, the desk, the bookshelves. I looked for anything unusual, any sign that Elaine had planned this disappearance. Then I remembered the small notebook. Elaine always kept notes in a thin, soft-covered notebook beside her phone. Schedules, appointments, phone numbers, everything was there. I went back to the kitchen table and opened the drawer where she usually kept it when she wasn't using it. The notebook was there, pushed toward the back, as if someone didn't want it in its usual place. I took it out, my hands trembling slightly. The first pages held familiar notes: grocery days, doctor appointments, group meetings. I flipped quickly to this week. On today's page, there was only a single letter, written in blue ink: R. No time, no place, no explanation. I flipped back a page. The previous day also had an R. Then the page before that. And another. The letter repeated itself, scattered across the days Elaine had said she had classes, activities, or short trips. I sank into the chair. My heart pounded so hard I had to place a hand on my chest to steady myself. I didn't know what R meant or who it was, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't random. I flipped to the back of the notebook. Inside the back cover, there was a phone number written in pencil with no name, just a string of digits. I stared at it for a long time. I picked up my phone, then set it down. I wasn't ready to call. Not yet. I stood up and walked around the house trying to breathe deeply. Memories flooded back. Evenings when Elaine sat writing in this notebook. Times she flipped through it to check her schedule, saying she was busy. All of it now appeared in a different light. I held the notebook in my hands, feeling how much heavier it was than its thin appearance suggested. Each R felt like a small cut, not deep, but enough to make me bleed slowly. I went back to the kitchen table and sat down, placing the notebook in front of me. I tried to connect everything. The trips, the classes, the receipts, the man in the cafe, and now the letter R and the unnamed phone number. The picture began to form, even though I didn't want to look at it directly. Part of me still hoped I was wrong. That R was just an abbreviation for a place, an event, something harmless. But another part of me, the part forged by a lifetime of facing hard truths, whispered that I was standing at the edge of something very bad. It was late when I finally put the notebook down and stood up. I locked the doors and drew the curtains as if those actions could protect me from the thoughts swirling in my head. I sat in the darkness for a long time, listening only to the clock ticking on the wall. Elaine still hadn't come home. Her phone was still off. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself to think about the worst possibility. Not an accident, not outside danger, but the truth that the woman I loved might have deliberately walked away from the life I believed was ours. I picked up the notebook again and looked at the letter R one more time. My heart tightened, as if bracing for an unavoidable collision. I still hadn't called that number. Not yet. But I knew very clearly that when I did, it wouldn't just be a phone call. A door would open. And behind that door might be the thing I had been avoiding for months, the truth about where I stood in my own life. I didn't sleep that night. Elaine's notebook lay on the kitchen table like silent evidence. The letter R and the unnamed phone number kept flashing through my mind every time I closed my eyes. I made coffee before it was fully light outside and sat by the window, watching thin fog settle over the empty road. Inside me, there was no longer confusion, but a cold determination. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. If I kept sitting there, waiting for Elaine to come back and explain, I would only let everything slip by again, through carefully chosen lies. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. The next morning, I took the most recent photo of Elaine from my phone. A family picture from not long ago, where she was still smiling exactly like a devoted wife, mother, and grandmother. I slipped it into my jacket pocket, took the notebook, got into the car, and drove straight toward Louisville. The city in the morning was busier than I remembered. Cars lined up, horns blaring, engines humming, voices everywhere. I parked near the downtown area, where several mid-range hotels were clustered. Not overly luxurious, but discreet enough for people who didn't want attention. I had no specific plan. I only had a feeling, and sometimes, at this age, intuition is the most reliable thing you have. The first hotel I entered had a bright lobby, a young receptionist, and a professional smile. I showed her the photo and calmly asked whether she had seen this woman recently. She glanced at it and quickly shook her head. No hesitation. The second hotel, then the third. The answer was the same. Some places looked at me with sympathy, others with caution. I began to feel exhausted, not from walking, but because every time I heard no, I wondered whether I was imagining everything. By the fourth hotel, a smaller place tucked into a quiet corner street, I walked in nearly drained. The lobby wasn't large, the smell of coffee mixed with cleaning chemicals. A receptionist around 25 wearing glasses was typing at the computer. I showed her the photo. She looked. Then she looked again. That hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but to me, it felt like a bolt of lightning straight to the chest. "Sir, do you know what name she registered under?" the receptionist asked, lowering her voice. I swallowed hard. "Elaine Miller." She looked at the screen, typed a few lines, then shook her head. "There's no one by that name." I was about to turn away when she looked up again, her expression uneasy. "But there is someone who looks very much like her. She registered under a different name." "What name?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Elaine Roberts." I froze. Roberts. Elaine's maiden name, the name she hadn't used for more than 40 years. Hearing it spoken in the unfamiliar space of a hotel lobby felt like someone had just called out to a different version of the woman I once knew. "She's staying alone?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. The receptionist shook her head, avoiding my eyes. "She's with a man. They checked in yesterday, second floor." My head spun, yet strangely I felt very clear, as if part of me had been preparing for this moment all along. Are they still here?" I asked. "They left this morning," she replied. "But they left the key. They might be coming back." I thanked her, though I don't know what my voice sounded like. I stepped outside, the midday sun hitting my eyes so sharply I had to squint. I crossed the street and stood facing the hotel, where a small cafe had a few outdoor tables. I chose a seat tucked away, ordered coffee, and sat down. I sat there for hours. Time dragged. I watched people going in and out of the hotel. Every middle-aged woman made my heart leap, then sink when I realized it wasn't Elaine. The coffee in front of me grew cold, but I didn't bother to replace it. By late afternoon, just as I began to wonder whether I was torturing myself for nothing, a gray car pulled up in front of the hotel. The door opened. Elaine stepped out of the passenger seat. I recognized her immediately, not because she looked different, but because she looked younger. Her steps were light, her shoulders straight, her face carrying a brightness I hadn't seen at home in months. Then the man stepped out of the driver's seat. He was tall, gray-haired, neatly dressed. When Elaine closed the car door, he placed his hand on her back naturally, familiarly, like a gesture repeated many times before. Elaine didn't pull away. They stood there for a few seconds, saying something I couldn't hear, and then Elaine laughed. That smile, the smile I once thought I understood, now appeared before me in a different setting, meant for someone else. I sat completely still. In that moment, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel jealousy. I felt only a deep emptiness, as if someone had gently lifted me out of my own life without my ever realizing it. They walked into the hotel together. I watched until the door closed behind them. Everything around me kept moving. Cars, pedestrians, laughter. But for me, the world seemed to slow by a single beat. I knew I had just witnessed a truth that couldn't be undone. Elaine hadn't just lied to me. She had built another life, under another name, in a place where I didn't belong. And in that life, I didn't exist. Not as a betrayed husband, but as someone who had been erased, with no place, no role, no presence at all. I sat there a little longer to make sure I wasn't acting on impulse. I took a deep breath and felt my heart beat slow. When I finally stood up, I knew very clearly that I had gone too far to turn back. I was no longer a man who merely suspected. I was a man who had seen the truth with his own eyes. And from that moment on, I understood that my 43-year marriage had ended in a way I never could have imagined. Not with an argument, not with a confession, but with the realization that in Elaine's life, I had not existed for a very long time. I stood in front of the hotel room door for a long time before knocking. The hallway was covered in dark carpet, the yellow lights casting a false sense of warmth. The faint scent of perfume mixed with air conditioning made my throat feel dry. I knew that all it would take was knocking on this door for my life to split in a different direction. There would be no more guessing, no room left for vague hope. Only the truth, bare and unforgiving. I raised my hand and knocked 3 slow times. There was a brief silence inside. Then footsteps. The latch clicked open. Elaine stood there. For a very brief moment, her face was filled with confusion, as if her mind hadn't yet caught up with what her eyes were seeing. Then the color drained from her face. Her eyes widened, her lips trembled. I had never seen her panic like that in more than 40 years together. "Howard," she whispered, her voice barely forming words. Why are you here?" I didn't answer right away. I looked her up and down, the blouse I had never seen before, her carefully styled hair, the shoes she never wore at home. Everything was far too put together for a woman who claimed she was just attending a group activity. Behind Elaine, the man stepped forward. He was slightly taller than me, neatly gray-haired, wearing glasses, with the composed air of an intellectual accustomed to calm. When he saw me, he froze. "What's going on, Elaine?" he asked, then turned to me. "And you are—" I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, yet my voice was strangely calm. "I'm her husband," I said. "Howard Miller." The room seemed to freeze. Elaine spun toward the man. "No, Richard, please listen to me." He looked at Elaine, then at me, his expression shifting from surprise to confusion, then to disbelief. "Husband?" he repeated. "Elaine, you told me—" "That I was dead," I finished for him. "Didn't you?" The man swallowed. "Elaine told me her husband passed away 2 years ago. Heart disease. I didn't feel the sharp pain I had imagined, just an icy cold spreading through my chest. So you buried me already," I said, turning to Elaine. "Buried me in your story." Elaine broke down in tears. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. But it wasn't the cry of someone caught cheating. It was the cry of someone stripped bare, with nowhere left to hide. "Howard, please, let's talk," she said, her voice cracking. "Not here." I stepped into the room. It was tidy. 2 suitcases lay open. 2 cups sat on the table. 2 coats hung side by side. Everything was so clear it needed no explanation. I stood in the middle of that room, where I should never have been, and for the first time in my life I truly felt like excess. Richard, I now knew his name, stood off to the side, looking both angry and confused. "Elaine," he said tightly, You told me he was gone. You swore it." Elaine nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I'm sorry. I know I lied." I didn't yell. I didn't break anything. I just stood there and listened. "When did this start?" I asked. Elaine took a deep breath, as if gathering what little courage she had left. "Almost 2 years ago, when I went to a retirement education conference in Louisville. I met Richard there. At first it was just talking, then coffee, then I felt listened to again." Richard turned to me, his face pained. "If I had known you were alive, if I had known she still had a husband, I never would have—" "I believe you," I said, and I truly did. The shock in his eyes wasn't an act. He was another victim of a carefully constructed lie. "Then, why not get divorced?" I asked Elaine. "Why kill me in your story?" Elaine wiped her tears and sat on the edge of the bed. "Because of my reputation," she said softly. "Because of that town, because of people's eyes, because of the children, because of everything I spent my whole life building. In Briar Hollow, I was the perfect principal, Howard Miller's wife. But here, I'm Elaine Roberts, a widow, free." I let out a quiet laugh, so dry it startled even me. "2 lives," I said. "One for people to see, one for you to live." Elaine looked at me, something strange in her eyes. Not quite regret, not quite fear, but the calculation of someone long accustomed to hiding. "I never thought you'd find out," she said. "I thought I could keep everything separate." "And what was I in that separation?" I asked. "A shadow?" "You were part of my life," Elaine said quickly. "The children's father, the grandchildren's grandfather. I didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt," I repeated, feeling how empty the word sounded. You erased me from your existence, Elaine. You told someone I was dead." The room fell silent. Richard's face went pale. "Elaine," he said slowly, "I need time. I can't stay here." He turned to me. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. Truly." I nodded. We looked at each other like two older men thrown into the same storm through no fault of our own. Richard grabbed his coat and left. The door closed behind him, leaving Elaine and me alone in the unfamiliar hotel room. Elaine stood up and stepped toward me. "Howard, please, at least let me explain." I looked at her for a long time. In that moment, I saw the woman I had once loved, built a house with, raised children with, but I also saw a stranger, someone who had decided her life could be divided into two compartments, and that I belonged only in the more convenient one. "I have nothing left to hear," I said. I turned and walked toward the door. Elaine called my name, her voice breaking. I didn't turn back, not because I hated her, but because if I did, I would once again become the man trying to patch up something that had already rotted from the inside. I stepped into the hallway and headed straight for the stairs. Each step felt heavy as lead. I didn't take any luggage. I didn't take any farewell. I carried only a truth that had been confirmed. When I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun hit my face. I took a deep breath. In that moment, I understood very clearly. In the story Elaine had been telling the world for the past 2 years, I was already dead. And from this moment on, I would have to learn how to live again, not as a betrayed husband, but as a man who had been given back the truth, even if the price was an entire lifetime. I left Louisville as evening fell, driving in silence the long road back to Briar Hollow. Streetlights stretched into tired streaks of light before my eyes. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I already knew what needed to be said and done. It just wasn't time yet. That night, I didn't go home. I stopped in front of my eldest son's house and sat in the car for a long time before getting out. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, pale with hollow eyes, he knew immediately that something was very wrong. I didn't circle around it. I said, "I need to talk. Right now." We sat in the living room under soft yellow light, the wall clock ticking steadily. My son sat across from me, my daughter-in-law standing silently behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder. I began to tell them everything, from Elaine's small changes, the trips, the notebook, the letter R, the hotel, the false name, to the moment I stood at the door and heard another man say my wife's name with familiarity. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften anything. I told it like someone recounting something that had already happened, even though every word felt like it was cutting into me. When I finished, the room was utterly silent. My son lowered his head, his hands clasped together, breathing hard. He didn't cry. He just kept shaking his head, as if his mind refused to accept what he had heard. My daughter-in-law covered her mouth, her eyes red. She looked at me, then turned away as if afraid her gaze might hurt me more. "That's impossible," my son said hoarsely. "Mom couldn't do that." I nodded. I used to think so too. The next morning my daughter came over. I told the story again, more slowly. She began to cry from the very first sentences. Not out of anger, but collapse. To my children, Elaine wasn't just their mother. She was the image of dedication and integrity, the person who always preached honesty, the emotional pillar of the family. And now that image shattered right in front of them. "So, she told people Dad was dead?" my daughter asked, her voice trembling. I nodded. No further explanation was needed. The two of them sat there for a long time. No one spoke. I understood that some pain doesn't need comfort. It needs time to find a new place for what was once believed. Elaine returned to town 2 days later. I didn't meet her right away. I let the children decide, and they were the ones who asked her to come talk. Not to me first, but to them. The meeting took place in my son's living room. I wasn't there. I didn't want my presence to make things more dramatic, but I knew the truth wouldn't be any gentler because I was absent. When Elaine walked into that room, she was no longer the confident, polished woman I had seen in Louisville. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped, her eyes avoiding contact. My children sat across from her, sitting straight, not angry, not shouting, just the seriousness of adults who had been forced to grow up one more time. "Is it true?" my son asked. "Did you tell people Dad was dead?" Elaine stayed silent for a long time. Then she nodded. At that moment, my daughter broke down, not sobbing, just quiet tears falling, like rain on dry ground. My son stood up, paced a few steps, then turned back, his voice tight. "Do you know what you've done? You didn't just betray Dad, you betrayed all of us." Elaine tried to explain. She talked about pressure, about feeling trapped, about not wanting to break the family apart. But every word only widened the distance. No one interrupted her, but no one nodded either. There was no way back. Once the truth had been spoken, it couldn't be taken back. Not because we were cruel, but because some cracks can't be sealed with apologies. My family, the framework I had spent my entire life building, didn't collapse in noise. It collapsed in silence, in avoided glances, in each person retreating to a corner to protect what was left of themselves. Elaine decided to move to the city permanently. No one stopped her. No one begged her to stay. The children said she was still their mother, but they needed time. Time to learn how to accept that their mother was also a human being capable of mistakes. Mistakes that hurt everyone. As for me, I returned to an empty house. I walked through each room, looking at the things that had once been ours. I didn't cry. Maybe the tears had already run out in Louisville. I packed a few necessities, gathered my documents, and went to see a lawyer I knew in town. When I told him I wanted to file for divorce, he looked at me for a long time. "At your age?" he asked gently. I nodded. "I've already died once," I said. "I don't want to keep living as a shadow." Signing divorce papers in my 70s was never something I imagined. My hand didn't shake. I only felt a deep exhaustion, as if I had finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for far too long. When I stepped out of the lawyer's office, I paused on the sidewalk and took a deep breath. The town was the same. Familiar shops, old streets, but I wasn't the same anymore. My family had changed, my marriage had ended, and I knew that from this moment on I would have to learn how to live with that truth, not with bitterness, but with the acceptance that some things, no matter how painful, must be named honestly, so they don't continue to control what remains of our lives. I moved out on my own in early fall that year. There was no loud packing, no arguments or tears. Just a few cardboard boxes, a few sets of clothes, essential documents, and personal items, enough for a man in his 70s to live simply. I chose a small house on the edge of town, not far from my old shop, but not too close to the roads Elaine and I had walked together for decades. I didn't want to run from memories, but I wasn't strong enough to face them every day either. On the first evening in the new house, I sat alone at the kitchen table and ate a simple dinner. No one asked if I wanted more salt. No familiar footsteps echoed in the living room. The silence wasn't frightening, but it was unfamiliar, like a new jacket that didn't quite fit yet. I sat there for a long time, watching the wall clock, listening to each tick, telling myself I would have to learn to live with this new rhythm. The town, however, was not as quiet as my
didn't press right away. He'd seen trauma before. He knew that tone. The kind that comes from people who've been through something they can't yet explain. They gave Ethan water, let him clean his face, took his statement. But the words came out slow, broken. He said he'd been hiking near the old quarry when his flashlight beam hit what looked like a metal latch in the ground. He thought it was a drainage cover. When he pried it open, he saw a tunnel. He followed it, half curiosity, half instinct, and at the end of it, he found a small, underground room. And in that room, he said, were 4 sealed barrels. At first, he thought it was old waste, maybe chemicals left behind from the mining days. But when he got closer, the smell changed. It wasn't chemical. It was organic. Rotting. He'd opened one, he told them. Just one. That was when he saw what was inside. He couldn't describe it in detail. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said enough. The sheriff called in the state police, who then looped in the FBI after confirming that what Ethan found wasn't animal remains. It wasn't local either. The markings on the barrels, faded but legible, belonged to a company that hadn't existed since 1992. A company once contracted for chemical disposal in 3 southern states. By dawn, the quiet little station was swarming with federal vehicles. The quarry was sealed off. News didn't break right away, but word travels fast in small towns. And through all of it, Ethan sat in silence, his hands still trembling. When one of the agents, a woman named Special Agent Dana Collier, finally sat across from him in the interview room, she noticed something strange. His clothes weren't just dusty. They were burned in places, singed like he'd been near a fire. And when she asked if he'd been alone at the site, he didn't answer. He just stared at the table, then whispered, almost to himself, "They told me it was gone." "Who told you that?" she asked. He looked up. "My brother," he said, "but he's been dead for 10 years. The agent froze. Later, she'd note in her report that it wasn't the words that unsettled her most. It was the way he said them. Calm. Certain. Like it wasn't confusion or grief speaking. It was fact. By sunrise, the barrels had been extracted from the site. Inside, they found what the FBI's field report would later describe as organic material consistent with multiple human remains. Each barrel had a serial code scratched off, but under infrared light, faint engraving marks became visible. 3 letters. DPR. When Agent Collier showed Ethan a photo of the engraving, his face went pale. He whispered something under his breath, too soft for the recorder to pick up. But the agent watching from the other side of the glass swore it sounded like a prayer, or a warning. By the end of the day, the FBI knew this wasn't just about buried remains. It was about
some things. I may not be perfect, but Elaine choosing to live 2 lives, choosing to erase me from half of her world, that was her decision, not my fault. Realizing that didn't make the pain disappear right away. It only softened it. And there are mornings when I wake up and, for the first few seconds, forget everything. Then the memories return, gently but without mercy. I've learned to let them be there, not to push them away, not to let them swallow me. I make coffee, open the window, breathe in the morning air, and remind myself that I am still alive. And I truly am still living. Not in the way I once imagined when I was young, not in the complete family picture I spent years building, but a real life with good days and bad days, with loneliness and also unexpected moments of peace. I learned to adapt to eating dinner alone, to making my own decisions, to not having to tell anyone when I'll be home late. There are small freedoms I never had before, They don't make me radiantly happy, but they help me stay steady on my feet. After 43 years of living with someone, living alone isn't easy, but it isn't the end either. It's just another chapter. Quieter, slower, but still worth living. And every morning, when I wake up and see sunlight coming through the window, I know that even though the pain is still there, I haven't let it define who I am. I keep living, not to prove anything to anyone, but to honor the life I was given. Some afternoons, when the sunlight slants through the window of my small house, I sit quietly for a long time and look back on my life the way one looks at a long road already traveled. I don't try to erase the rough stretches, and I don't paint the smooth ones prettier than they were. I look straight at it all, the years of hard work, the days of family togetherness, and the biggest scar I carry from a marriage that lasted more than 40 years. I don't deny that scar. I don't show it off like a trophy either. It's there, a quiet mark reminding me that I lived honestly, loved honestly, and was hurt honestly. At this age, I no longer need to pretend I'm fine or act strong. I only need to be truthful with myself. The truth, I've learned, is always painful at first. It's like light flooding into a dark room, making your eyes ache. But that same light shows you where you're standing, what you're stumbling over, and how to move forward. If I hadn't gone back home that day, if I hadn't opened that notebook, if I hadn't knocked on that hotel door, I might still be living in a marriage that had long been dead without ever knowing it. I would have kept playing the role of the present husband, while somewhere else I had already been buried under very smooth lies. The truth freed me, not because it was comforting, but because it ended the deception. When I no longer had to doubt, no longer had to ask myself every night what I had done wrong, I could breathe normally again. I no longer had to live halfway, half believing, half doubting, a state that exhausts a person even more than pure pain. I choose not to let that betrayal define who I am. I don't want to become the man whose wife cheated on him in my own story. I am more than that. I'm a father, a grandfather, a craftsman who spent his life making things that were solid and useful. I loved a woman with everything I had at that time, and the fact that that love wasn't returned the way I hoped doesn't make it meaningless. Sometimes I ask myself, if I could go back, would I do things differently? Maybe I would ask more questions, listen more closely. But then I stop, because that line of thinking leads nowhere. I can't fix the past with hypotheticals. I can only live decently in the present and avoid repeating what made me lose myself. My children and grandchildren are the biggest reason I keep moving forward with a lighter heart. When I watch them laugh in the yard, when I hear them call my name in their clear voices, I understand that life doesn't end with a marriage. The real bonds, family, responsibility, shared memories are still there. They don't disappear just because one person chose a different path. Growing old, I've realized, doesn't mean the end. It's just a slower rhythm of life. At that pace, you see more clearly the things you once overlooked when you were rushing. You learn to appreciate a quiet morning, a hot cup of coffee, an unhurried conversation. You learn that happiness doesn't have to be loud. It can come from living true to your values, a little each day. If there's one thing I want to leave with anyone listening to this story, it's honesty in marriage. Not only honesty with your partner, but honesty with yourself. When someone is no longer happy, admitting it, no matter how hard, is still better than building two parallel lives. Living two lives requires too many lies, and lies always have an expiration date. When they collapse, it's not just one person who gets hurt, but everyone who trusted you. I'm not writing these words to condemn anyone. I only want to remind you that the truth, however painful, is the strongest foundation for standing up and moving forward. I lost a marriage, but I didn't lose myself. And in my 70s, that is something worth holding on to. If you've stayed with me until these final lines, I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm curious where you're listening to my story from, what city or town, and what time it is where you are right now. If this story touched you in any way, whether it stirred a memory, an old wound, or offered a lesson for the present, please leave a few words in the comments. Like this if you feel these honest experiences are worth telling, and subscribe to the channel to keep me company in the stories to come. At this age, every listener, every response is a precious gift. Thank you for spending time with an old man telling his story, and I wish you the courage to live truthfully with your own life.